What would you do if you discovered someone was slowly poisoning you with your own medication? Would you confront them? Call the police? Or would you do what I did? Let them think their plan was working while you prepared a chemistry lesson they'd never forget. When I found my blood pressure pills had been tampered with, I didn't panic. I got creative. My name is Betty White, and at 60 years old, I've learned that the most dangerous people in your life are often the ones who smile while they pour your morning coffee. 3 months ago, if someone had told me that my own stepson would try to murder me with my blood pressure medication, I would have laughed and told them they watched too many crime shows. But here I was, standing in my kitchen at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, holding 2 identical bottles of pills that were definitely not identical anymore. It had started so subtly that I almost missed it. Marcus, my late husband Harold's son from his first marriage, had moved in 6 months earlier after losing his job in the tech industry. "Just until I get back on my feet, Betty," he'd said with that boyish smile that had charmed Harold for 35 years. "It'll be like having a son around to help with things." At first, it really was helpful. Marcus fixed the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, updated my computer, and even cooked dinner twice a week. But then I started noticing little things. The way he watched me take my morning pills, always volunteering to refill my weekly pill organizer, how he'd ask detailed questions about my doctor's appointments, my test results, my medication schedule. "Just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself, Betty." He didn't. "Harold would want me to look out for you."
Harold?
My dear Harold, who'd died of a sudden heart attack 8 months ago, leaving me with a modest but comfortable inheritance and a house that was finally paid off after 30 years of marriage.
Harold?
Who'd made me promise to be kind to Marcus because he's had a hard life. Betty. His mother left when he was 12, and he's never quite figured out how to land on his feet. What Harold hadn't known, what I'd kept to myself out of loyalty and love, was that Marcus had been asking me about money since the funeral. Subtle questions at first. "Do you think you'll stay in this big house, Betty? Have you thought about what you want to do with Harold's coin collection? It must be expensive to maintain all this property on your own." Then the questions became suggestions. "Betty, you know there are some really nice retirement communities that handle all the maintenance for you. Have you considered simplifying your finances? I could help you consolidate some accounts. This house is worth a fortune in today's market. You could sell it and live comfortably anywhere." But I wasn't ready to live anywhere else. This house held 40 years of memories with Harold. Every room had echoes of our laughter, our conversations, our quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper together. I wasn't ready to give that up for Marcus's peace of mind about my finances. That's when I started feeling sick. It began with headaches that came without warning, sharp pains behind my eyes that made me dizzy and nauseous. Then came the fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that left me napping in my chair by 2 in the afternoon. My blood pressure, which had been stable for 5 years on medication, suddenly started spiking dangerously high, sending me to the emergency room twice in 3 weeks. "Mrs. White," Dr. Martinez had said during my last visit, frowning at my chart, "these readings don't make sense. Your medication should be controlling this. Are you taking your pills consistently? Same time every day?" "Every morning with breakfast, just like I have for 5 years," I'd told her, which was the truth. What I hadn't told her was that for the past month, those morning pills had been tasting different, slightly more bitter, with a gritty texture that dissolved differently on my tongue. Dr. Martinez increased my dosage and added a second medication. "If we can't get this under control, Mrs. White, we're looking at serious risk of stroke or heart attack. At your age, high blood pressure isn't something we can ignore." At my age, 60 wasn't exactly ancient. But everyone seemed to think it was, including Marcus, who'd started hovering around me more, asking how I was feeling, whether I needed him to drive me to appointments, if I wanted him to organize my medications to make sure I didn't miss doses. "You know, Betty," he'd said just last week, "if something happened to you, God forbid, but if it did, would I even know where to find your important papers? Your will, your insurance policies?" I'd looked at him across the dinner table. This man who looked so much like Harold, but whose eyes held none of Harold's warmth, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "Marcus, do you have somewhere else you could stay? I'm starting to feel like I need some space to process Harold's death." His face had changed then, just for a moment. The helpful concern slipped away, and something much harder took its place. Betty, I think the stress of Harold's death is affecting your judgment. You're not thinking clearly. Maybe you shouldn't be making big decisions right now. That night, I'd lain in bed thinking about that conversation, about the way Marcus had looked at me, about my mysteriously worsening health, and that's when it hit me. What if my blood pressure wasn't getting worse despite my medication? What if it was getting worse because of my medication? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 40 years of taking prescription drugs. Instead of swallowing my blood pressure pill, I palmed it, kept it hidden in my hand while I went through my normal morning routine, then slipped it into a small envelope once Marcus had left for his daily job hunting. For the next week, I palmed every blood pressure pill. Marcus watched me take. I felt better almost immediately. The headache stopped. The dizziness faded. My energy returned. And when I took my blood pressure with the home monitor Dr. Martinez had recommended, the readings were normal. Someone was tampering with my medication, and that someone had access to my pills every morning when they helped me organize my weekly pill dispenser. But here's what Marcus didn't know about me. Before I married Harold, before I became a housewife and stepmother, I'd spent 15 years teaching high school chemistry. I knew how to test substances, how to identify compounds, and most importantly, how to create controlled experiments that would give me definitive answers. It was time to find out exactly what my helpful stepson had been feeding me, instead of my life-saving medication, and once I had that information, it would be time to teach Marcus a lesson about the dangers of underestimating a chemistry teacher who'd been mixing compounds since he was in diapers. The first step in any good investigation is establishing baseline data. I'd learned that in my second year of teaching, when I had to prove that Tommy Richardson was cheating on his chemistry tests by mixing different combinations of answers from previous year's exams. Tommy thought he was clever. He had no idea his teacher had been documenting patterns for months. Marcus was about to discover that those same investigative skills worked just as well on attempted murderers as they did on cheating teenagers. I started by creating what I called my evidence protocol. Every morning, I would palm the blood pressure pill Marcus watched me take, storing it in a labeled envelope with the date and time. I continued taking my real medication from a backup bottle I kept hidden in my bedroom. Pills I'd been stockpiling by claiming I'd dropped them or forgotten whether I'd taken my dose. But that was just the beginning. I also started documenting everything else Marcus did around my medication routine. The times he offered to help organize my pills, the way he watched me take them, the questions he asked about my symptoms and doctor visits, the conversations where he mentioned my mortality or the burden of taking care of this big house alone. Within a week, I had a disturbing pattern documented. Marcus was most helpful with my medications on the days before I had doctor's appointments or blood pressure checks. He was most interested in my symptoms when I was feeling worst, and he was most talkative about my finances and future living arrangements when my health seemed most precarious. But I needed more than suspicions and patterns. I needed proof of what he was actually giving me instead of my prescribed medication. That's where my chemistry background became invaluable. I set up what I called Lab Betty in Harold's old workshop in the garage, a space Marcus never went, because he claimed the smell of Harold's wood stains gave him headaches. Using equipment I'd quietly purchased online over the past week, I began testing the pills Marcus had been giving me. The first test was simple visual analysis under magnification. My real blood pressure medication was uniform in color and texture, with no visible particles or inconsistencies. The pills Marcus had been providing looked similar to the naked eye, but under magnification, I could see they contained visible specks of different materials mixed in with what appeared to be the original medication. Next came solubility testing. I dissolved both the real pills and Marcus's pills in distilled water and compared the solutions. My real medication dissolved completely, leaving a clear solution with a slightly bitter taste. Marcus's version left a cloudy residue and tasted not just bitter but metallic and sharp, like something that was burning my tongue. But the most revealing test was pH analysis. Blood pressure medication should create a solution with a specific pH range when dissolved in water. Marcus's pills created a solution that was significantly more acidic, indicating the presence of additional compounds that had no business being in prescription medication. Here's what really made my blood run cold. When I tested the residue left behind by Marcus's pills, It showed positive for compounds commonly found in household cleaning products. Someone had been mixing my life-saving medication with substances that were slowly poisoning me. 3 weeks into my investigation, I had documented evidence of attempted murder. Marcus wasn't just trying to make me sick enough to question my independence. He was actually trying to kill me slowly and subtly, in a way that would look like natural deterioration of my health. But I wasn't done gathering evidence, because while I now knew what Marcus was doing, I still needed to prove how he was doing it, and most importantly, why. The how became clear when I set up a tiny surveillance camera in the kitchen, disguised as a decorative coffee canister. Every Sunday night, Marcus would offer to organize my weekly pill dispenser, a helpful gesture that I now watched him use to switch out my blood pressure medication with his toxic substitutes. He was careful, methodical, and completely confident that I would never notice the difference. The why required a different kind of investigation. While Marcus was out at what he claimed were job interviews, I searched his room. What I found made my chemistry teacher's heart skip several beats. Hidden in his closet, tucked inside an old gym bag, were documents that painted a very different picture of Marcus's financial situation. Bank statements showing massive gambling debts, loan documents with payment schedules he couldn't possibly meet, and most damning of all, a handwritten note in his own writing that made my hands shake as I read it. Betty's will leaves everything to me if she dies of natural causes. House worth $800, plus investments and life insurance. If she gets sick enough, she'll have to go to assisted living and I can sell the house to pay for her care. Either way, I get the money. Just need to make sure her health problems look natural and happen fast enough that she doesn't change the will. He'd been planning this for months. The helpful son-in-law routine, the concern about my living alone, the offers to manage my finances. It had all been building toward this moment when he could cash in on Harold's inheritance by eliminating me. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that 60-year-old Betty White was just Harold's quiet wife, a woman who'd spent her life taking care of other people and never learned to take care of herself. He had no idea that this quiet housewife had spent 15 years teaching teenagers how to identify unknown compounds, how to design controlled experiments, and how to document evidence so thoroughly that even the most skeptical authority would have to accept the conclusions. And he definitely didn't know that his chemistry teacher's stepmother was about to give him a practical demonstration in cause and effect that he would never forget. Now came the most delicate part of my operation, letting Marcus think his plan was working, while I prepared to turn his own methods against him. After 20 years of managing a classroom full of teenagers who thought they were smarter than their teacher, I'd learned that the key to catching someone in the act was giving them enough rope to hang themselves with. I started by adjusting my own performance. Instead of secretly maintaining my health while documenting his attempts to poison me, I began acting like his toxic medication was having the intended effect. I let myself look tired when he was around. I mentioned feeling dizzy after taking my morning pills. I even staged a couple of minor incidents, dropping a coffee cup, forgetting where I'd put my car keys, to make him think his plan was working. Marcus responded exactly as I'd expected. He became more attentive, more helpful, and much more interested in my day-to-day health management. He started asking if I needed him to drive me to doctor appointments, whether I should consider getting one of those medical alert devices, if I'd thought any more about downsizing to a smaller living space. "Betty, I'm worried about you," he said one morning, watching me pretend to struggle with opening my pill bottle. "Your hands are shaking more lately. Are you sure you're taking your medication correctly?" I let my voice sound slightly confused, a little overwhelmed. "I think so, Marcus. But everything seems so complicated lately. Thank goodness I have you to help keep track of things." His eyes lit up with what I now recognized wasn't concern. It was anticipation. "You know what, Betty? Maybe it would be easier if I just took over managing all your medications. That way you don't have to worry about remembering doses or organizing pills. I could set up a system." "A system?" "I bet he could." "That's very thoughtful of you, Marcus. Harold always said you were a good boy who just needed the right opportunity to shine." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus gradually took over more and more of my medication management. He organized my pills, reminded me when it was time to take them, and even started accompanying me to doctor appointments to make sure I didn't forget to mention any symptoms. What Marcus didn't know was that I was now running what I thought of as a double-blind experiment. He thought he was giving me higher doses of his toxic medication combination, accelerating my decline. In reality, I was taking my normal prescribed medications from my hidden supply and only pretending to take what he provided. But I wasn't just documenting his actions anymore. I was preparing his consequences. See, Marcus had made a fundamental error in his approach to poisoning me. He'd assumed that because I was older, because I was just Harold's wife, because I seemed to trust him completely, I wouldn't fight back even if I discovered what he was doing. He thought that even if I got suspicious, I'd be too scared, too overwhelmed, or too dependent on him to take action. What he didn't understand was that chemistry teachers don't just learn how to identify compounds, they also learn how to create them. And after weeks of analyzing exactly what Marcus had been feeding me, I had a very clear understanding of how those same compounds could be redirected. The beautiful thing about Marcus's poison of choice was that it was made from common household products, substances that could be found in any cleaning supply cabinet, mixed in ways that would be almost impossible to detect without sophisticated testing. It was actually quite clever, if you ignored the fact that he was using it to commit murder. But here's what made his approach perfect for my purposes. If these compounds were toxic to me, in small doses over time, they would be much more immediately effective in larger doses over a shorter period. And if Marcus was comfortable using these methods to hurt me, he shouldn't object when those same methods were applied to him. I began my preparation by documenting everything Marcus ate and drank on a regular basis. Coffee every morning from the same mug. Orange juice with breakfast. A protein shake after his daily workout. Dinner that I usually prepared, served on the same plates, with drinks from the same glasses. Marcus had established patterns, routines that made him predictable. And predictability, as any good chemistry teacher knows, is the foundation of a successful controlled experiment. The next step was preparation of materials. Using the same compounds Marcus had been adding to my medication, I began creating what I thought of as return samples, carefully measured doses, precisely calculated based on Marcus's body weight and metabolism, designed to give him exactly the same experience he'd been giving me, but accelerated to match his timeline expectations. I wasn't going to kill Marcus. I'm not a murderer, but I was going to make sure he understood exactly what he'd been doing to me, how it felt to be slowly poisoned by someone you trusted, and why his chemistry teacher's stepmother was not the helpless victim he'd assumed she would be. The final component of my plan required the most delicate timing. Marcus needed to experience the effects of his own medicine in a way that would be unmistakably connected to his actions toward me. He needed to understand that this wasn't random illness or bad luck. This was deliberate, calculated justice delivered by someone who'd been watching and learning from his techniques. I chose a Friday evening for the practical demonstration. Marcus had just finished telling me how worried he was about my increasing confusion and weakness, how he thought we should schedule a meeting with a lawyer to make sure my affairs were in order, just in case something happens. "You're so thoughtful, Marcus," I said, pouring his usual evening protein shake and adding the carefully measured dose I'd prepared. "Harold would be so proud of how you're taking care of me." As I handed him the glass, I watched his face carefully. He was confident, pleased with himself, already planning how to spend my inheritance. He had no idea that in about 30 minutes, he was going to start understanding exactly what his victim had been experiencing for the past 3 months. And tomorrow morning, when the effects were at their worst, Marcus was going to receive a chemistry lesson that would teach him why you should never underestimate your teacher's ability to learn from your mistakes and improve upon your methods. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that makes you want to stay in bed with a cup of coffee and a good book. But I was up at dawn, sitting in my kitchen with my real coffee and my documentation files, waiting for Marcus to discover what I'd learned from his teaching methods. At 7:23 a.m., I heard the first sounds of distress from the guest room. A groan, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone stumbling to the bathroom. Marcus was awake and beginning to experience what I'd been dealing with for 3 months. The headaches, the nausea, the dizziness that comes when someone adds toxic compounds to your daily routine. 20 minutes later, he appeared in the kitchen, looking pale and unsteady. "Betty," he said, gripping the doorframe for support. "I think I'm coming down with something. I feel terrible." I looked up from my newspaper with the same expression of mild concern he'd been giving me for months. "Oh no, Marcus. You do look a bit peaked. Have you been taking care of yourself? Sometimes when we're stressed about money and job hunting, our health can suffer. He made it to the coffee maker, his hand shaking slightly as he poured a cup. I don't understand it. I felt fine yesterday, and then around midnight I started getting this pounding headache, and my stomach. That sounds awful, I said, sympathetically. You know, I've been experiencing similar symptoms lately. Dr. Martinez thinks it might be stress-related. The body has ways of telling us when we're pushing too hard. Marcus drank his coffee. The same coffee I'd prepared with the same careful attention to compound distribution that he'd done showing my medication, and I watched the additional dose begin its work. His complexion grew paler, and he had to sit down heavily in the chair across from me. Maybe I should see a doctor, he said, pressing his palms against his temples. This doesn't feel like a normal headache. That's probably wise, I agreed. Though you know how doctors are. They always want to run expensive tests and prescribe medications. Sometimes these things just have to run their course. For the next hour, I watched Marcus experience what I'd been living with, compressed into an accelerated timeline that gave him immediate understanding of exactly what he'd been putting me through. The nausea that made it impossible to eat breakfast. The dizziness that made standing up a careful, calculated movement. The confusion that came when your body was fighting against substances it was never meant to process. But I wasn't just observing Marcus's discomfort. I was documenting it, the same way I'd documented his attempts to poison me, every symptom, every complaint, every moment when he looked at me with the dawning realization that something was very wrong. At 9:15 a.m., Marcus made the connection I'd been waiting for. Betty, he said slowly, his eyes narrowing despite the obvious pain he was experiencing. Did you do something to my food? I set down my coffee cup and looked at him directly, no longer bothering with the confused, helpless expression I'd been wearing for months. Marcus, that's an interesting question. Are you asking because you think someone might tamper with another person's food or medication without their knowledge? His face went white, whiter than the toxic compounds had already made it. What are you talking about? I stood up calmly and walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd prepared a visual aid for this moment. I returned to the table, carrying a large manila folder, the kind I used to use for organizing lesson plans back when I was teaching. Marcus, I think it's time for a little chemistry review, I said, opening the folder to reveal weeks of documented evidence. Photos of the pills he'd been substituting. Lab analysis results, showing the toxic compounds he'd been adding to my medication. Copies of his bank statements, and that handwritten note about my will. His mouth fell open as he stared at the evidence spread across our kitchen table. Where did you get 40 years of teaching chemistry, Marcus? You learn to spot when someone's trying to cheat the system. I arranged the photographs so he could see them clearly, despite his increasingly obvious visual disturbance. You also learn how to design controlled experiments, document evidence, and most importantly, how to reproduce results. I watched as he realized what I was telling him. The symptoms he was experiencing weren't random illness. They were the direct result of the same compounds he'd been feeding me, delivered through the same methods he'd been using, just with better dosing calculations. You poisoned me, he whispered, and I had to admire the genuine outrage in his voice. It takes impressive self-absorption to sound indignant about receiving the same treatment you've been giving someone else. Marcus, I prefer to think of it as a practical demonstration. You've been teaching me about these compounds for months. I'm simply showing you that I've been paying attention to your lessons. He tried to stand up, probably planning to storm out or call the police, but the dizziness sent him back into his chair. This is illegal. You can't just poison people because you think they've done something wrong. I laughed. Actually laughed at the beautiful irony of that statement. Marcus, you're absolutely right. Poisoning people is illegal. It's attempted murder, actually. Which is why I've spent the last month documenting every single instance of you tampering with my medication. I pulled out another set of photos. These ones showing Marcus switching out my pills in my weekly medication organizer, taken by the surveillance camera he'd never noticed in the kitchen. I have video evidence, chemical analysis proving what you substituted for my prescribed medication, and documentation of your motive. I continued, enjoying the way his face kept getting paler with each piece of evidence I revealed. What I gave you this morning was a single demonstration dose, designed to help you understand what you've been putting me through. What you gave me was attempted murder, spread out over months to avoid detection. Marcus was gripping the edge of the table now, his knuckles white with either pain or panic. What do you want? What do I want? I considered the question carefully. Well, Marcus, that depends on what you're prepared to do to make this right. I leaned back in my chair, studying the man who had moved into my home with the intention of slowly killing me for my inheritance. He looked small now, diminished by both the physical effects of his own medicine and the realization that his victim had been 10 steps ahead of him from the beginning. First, you're going to pack your belongings and leave my house. Today, you're going to find somewhere else to live, get a real job, and start paying back those gambling debts without involving me or Harold's memory. He nodded weakly, probably too sick to argue. Second, you're going to write out a full confession to what you've been doing, the medication tampering, the toxic compounds, the plan to inherit my money by making my death look natural. You're going to sign it, date it, and give me a copy before you leave. And if I don't? I smiled. The same smile I used to give students who thought they could negotiate their way out of the consequences. Consequences. Cheating. If you don't, Marcus, I take all of this evidence to the police, the district attorney, and anyone else who will listen. You'll be arrested for attempted murder, and you'll spend the next 10 to 20 years in prison learning about chemistry from people who are much less patient teachers than I am. Marcus stared at me across the kitchen table. This woman he'd thought was Harold's helpless widow, finally understanding that he'd been played by an expert from the very beginning. How long have you known? He asked quietly. I suspected something was wrong 6 weeks ago, when my health started deteriorating, despite my medication. I confirmed you were tampering with my pills 4 weeks ago. I've been running a controlled experiment on you ever since, documenting your methods and preparing an appropriate response. He shook his head slowly, wincing at the movement. You let me think it was working. You let me believe. I let you reveal exactly who you are and what you're capable of. I corrected. And now you get to experience exactly what that feels like from the other side. The next few hours were perhaps the most satisfying of my 60 years on Earth. I watched Marcus pack his belongings with shaking hands, write out his confession in handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady as my lesson continued its work, and finally load his car while fighting off waves of nausea and dizziness. Before he left, he stood in my doorway one last time, looking like he wanted to say something. Betty, are you going to call the police? I considered the question. That depends entirely on whether I ever see you again, Marcus. If you disappear quietly and never contact me again, this stays between us. If you ever come back, if you ever try to contact me, if I ever hear that you've tried this with someone else, then every piece of evidence I have gets delivered to law enforcement. He nodded and stumbled toward his car, still fighting the effects of a single dose of his own medicine. As I watched him drive away, probably heading to the emergency room for treatment he wouldn't be able to afford, I realized that justice doesn't always come from the legal system. Sometimes it comes from a chemistry teacher who spent 40 years learning how to identify problems, design solutions, and teach unforgettable lessons to people who think they're smarter than she is. Marcus had tried to murder me slowly and quietly, thinking that Harold's widow would never figure out what was happening. Instead, he discovered that this widow was perfectly capable of fighting back, and that underestimating your teacher is always a dangerous mistake. 3 days after Marcus's departure, I was sitting in Dr. Martinez's office, watching her frown at my latest blood pressure readings with the same confusion she'd shown for months. Mrs. White, I have to admit, I'm baffled, she said, looking back and forth between my current numbers and my chart from previous visits. Your blood pressure has completely normalized. These are the best readings I've seen from you in over a year. I maintained the same expression of pleasant confusion I'd perfected during my months of investigation. That's wonderful news, doctor. Do you think it was the medication adjustment you made last month? That's what's strange, Dr. Martinez continued. We increased your dosage significantly because your previous readings were so concerning. With this much medication, your blood pressure should be much lower than normal. But these numbers suggest you're processing the medication exactly as expected for your original prescription. I nodded thoughtfully. Maybe the stress of living with my stepson was affecting my health more than we realized. He moved out this weekend, and I'm already sleeping better. Dr. Martinez looked up from my chart with interest. Stress can definitely impact blood pressure, but usually not to this degree. What kind of stress were you experiencing? Oh, you know how it is when you have family staying with you long term, I said, maintaining my tone of gentle explanation. Marcus was going through some financial difficulties, and I think the pressure of that situation was affecting both of us. He's found other living arrangements now, so I'm hoping my health will continue to improve. Well, whatever the cause, these numbers are exactly where we want them to be, Dr. Martinez said, making notes in my file. Let's continue with your current medication schedule and check again in 3 months. If your readings stay stable, we might even be able to reduce your dosage. As I left the doctor's office, I reflected on the elegant simplicity of the solution. Marcus was gone. My health was restored, and everyone who needed to know had a perfectly reasonable explanation for both developments. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to remove its source and let natural healing take its course. But my work wasn't finished yet. Over the next week, I methodically destroyed all evidence of my counter-experiment, while preserving everything related to Marcus's attempted poisoning. The compounds I'd prepared for his chemistry lesson went down the drain with plenty of bleach and hot water. My hidden surveillance equipment was restored to its original decorative purpose. My laboratory setup in Harold's workshop was carefully disassembled and packed away. What remained was a comprehensive file documenting Marcus's crime, stored in a safety deposit box at my bank, with instructions for its delivery to law enforcement. If anything ever happened to me, insurance, you might call it, against the possibility that Marcus might someday decide to try a different approach to claiming Harold's inheritance. 2 weeks after Marcus's departure, I received a phone call that confirmed my educational methods had been effective. Betty? The voice was weak, uncertain, barely recognizable as the confident young man who'd been managing my pill organizer just days earlier. Hello, Marcus, I said calmly. I hope you're feeling better. I wanted to apologize for everything. I never should have. His voice trailed off, probably because he couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. Marcus, apologies are meaningless without understanding. Do you understand what you did wrong? There was a long pause. I tried to hurt you. I tried to make you sick so you could inherit Harold's money by murdering me slowly enough that it would look like natural causes. I finished for him. Yes, that's exactly what you did. How did you figure it out? He asked quietly. Because I spent 40 years teaching teenagers who thought they were smarter than their chemistry teacher, I replied. You all make the same mistakes. You underestimate your target. You get overconfident in your methods, and you never consider that someone might be studying your techniques and preparing to use them against you. The stuff you gave me, what was it? The same compounds you were feeding me? Marcus? Exactly the same. Just in a single, concentrated dose, instead of spread out over months. I thought you should understand what your victim was experiencing. Another long pause. I deserved it. Yes, you did. The question now is, what you're going to do with this lesson. I found a job, Marcus said, his voice still shaky. Security guard at a warehouse. Night shift. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work. That's a good start. Betty, I need you to know, I'm never going to bother you again. I'm never going to try anything like this with anyone else. What you did to me, I never want to feel that helpless again. I smiled, recognizing the tone of a student who had finally learned the lesson I'd been trying to teach. Marcus, that helpless feeling you experienced, that's how every victim of abuse feels. Every elderly person who's taken advantage of, every vulnerable person who's manipulated by someone they trusted. The difference is, they don't usually have a chemistry teacher stepmother who can fight back. I know, I understand now. I hope you do, Marcus. Because if you ever hurt another vulnerable person, if you ever try to take advantage of someone's trust the way you took advantage of mine, I'll find out about it. And next time, my chemistry lesson will be much longer and much more thorough. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet house, surrounded by the memories of my life, with Harold and the satisfaction of a problem solved through careful observation, methodical planning, and precise execution. Marcus had tried to murder me because he saw a 60-year-old widow as an easy target, someone who would never suspect his methods or fight back against his plans. He'd underestimated the value of experience, the power of knowledge, and the determination of a woman who'd spent decades teaching young people that actions have consequences. But there was one more element to my story that needed addressing. Harold. That evening, I sat in his favorite chair with a cup of tea and spoke to his photograph on the side table. I'm sorry, honey, I said to his gentle smile. I know you loved Marcus, and I know you wanted me to take care of him after you were gone, but what you didn't know What I never told you was that Marcus was never the son you thought he was. He was always calculating, always looking for an angle, always wondering what he could get from people who cared about him. I paused, sipping my tea and remembering the man who'd shared my life for 30 years. You were a good man, Harold, and good people sometimes can't see the darkness in others. But I could see it. I've been watching Marcus for years, waiting for him to show his true nature. You just gave him the opportunity and the motivation he needed. The house was quiet around me, filled with peace for the first time since Marcus had moved in. He won't be back, I continued. And he won't try this with anyone else. Someone's the best way to honor good people is to make sure the bad people in their lives can't hurt anyone else. Your chemistry teacher wife just gave your son a lesson he'll remember for the rest of his life. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that this experience had taught me something important about myself. At 60 years old, I thought my teaching days were behind me. I thought my skills in observation, analysis, and problem solving were just memories from a career that had ended when I married Harold. But Marcus had shown me that those skills weren't just professional tools, they were survival skills, and apparently was much better at survival than anyone, including myself, had realized. 6 months later, I was standing in front of a group of 30 seniors at the Golden Valley Community Center, looking out at faces that reminded me of my old classroom. Some interested, some skeptical, some clearly there because someone else thought they needed to be. How many of you, I began, have ever felt like someone was trying to take advantage of you because of your age? Nearly every hand in the room went up. How many of you have been told you're too trusting, too generous, too willing to help family members who might not have your best interests at heart? Even more hands rose. And how many of you have ever wished you had the knowledge and skills to fight back when someone underestimated you? This time, every single hand in the room was raised, and I saw something in their faces that I recognized from my best teaching days, the hunger to learn something that would make them stronger, smarter, more capable of protecting themselves. My name is Betty White, I continued, and 6 months ago, my stepson tried to tour me by tampering with my medication. He thought that because I was a 60-year-old widow, I would never figure out what he was doing. He was wrong. The room was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward with the kind of attention that every teacher dreams of receiving. Today, I'm going to teach you how to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate or harm you, how to document evidence of their actions, and how to protect yourself using methods they'll never see coming. Because the best defense against people who underestimate you is to be exactly as dangerous as they think you're not. Over the next 2 hours, I taught them about medication tampering, financial abuse, psychological manipulation, and evidence gathering. I showed them how to test their own medications for tampering, how to document suspicious behavior, how to recognize the warning signs of someone who saw their age as an opportunity for exploitation. But most importantly, I taught them that being older didn't mean being helpless. It meant having decades of experience, knowledge, and skills that younger predators couldn't imagine or defend against. The person who tries to scam you, I told them, is counting on you to be confused, frightened, and isolated. They want you to feel like you have no options, no resources, no way to fight back. What they don't understand is that you've survived decades of challenges, solved countless problems, and learned lessons they haven't even heard of yet. After the presentation, a woman named Margaret approached me, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope mixed with determination. "Mrs. White," she said, "my grandson has been pressuring me to sign over power of attorney to him. He says it's for my own good, but something about the way he talks about it makes me uncomfortable. Could you help me figure out if he's trying to help me or help himself?" I looked at Margaret, seeing the same vulnerability I'd felt when Marcus first moved in, the same confusion about whether to trust her instincts or her family. But I also saw the strength that came from finally having someone who understood her situation and could help her navigate it safely. "Margaret," I said, "how would you like to learn how to conduct your own investigation? By the time we're finished, you'll know exactly what your grandson is planning, and you'll have all the tools you need to protect yourself." 3 weeks later, Margaret had documented evidence that her grandson was planning to use his power of attorney to sell her house and move her to a nursing home so he could access her savings. She'd also learned how to set up her own surveillance, gather legal documentation, and present her case to authorities if necessary. But more importantly, Margaret had learned that she didn't have to be a victim. At 74, she discovered that her experience and intelligence were weapons that could be used against people who thought her age made her defenseless. Within 6 months, my senior defense workshop had expanded to 12 different community centers across 3 counties. I was teaching hundreds of seniors how to recognize financial abuse, medical manipulation, and psychological coercion. But more than that, I was teaching them how to fight back. Some of my students went on to catch family members who were stealing their medications. Others documented evidence of financial abuse and recovered thousands of dollars in stolen assets. A few even helped law enforcement break up organized scams targeting elderly victims. But the most rewarding part of teaching these workshops wasn't the individual victories. It was watching people rediscover their own power, seeing 70-year-olds realize they could still learn new skills, watching 80-year-olds stand up to family members who'd been manipulating them for years, helping people understand that their age wasn't a limitation. It was an advantage. 1 year after Marcus left my house, I received a letter that made everything worthwhile. It was from a woman named Dorothy in Phoenix, who'd attended one of my workshops when I'd expanded the program to Arizona. "Dear Mrs. White," the letter read, "I wanted to thank you for teaching me that being 68 years old doesn't mean being helpless. Last month, a man claiming to be from Medicare started calling me about updating my benefits. He wanted to visit my home to help me fill out new paperwork, and he insisted I shouldn't tell anyone about our meeting because it might complicate the process. 6 months ago, I probably would have let him come over. I would have trusted that he was legitimate, signed whatever papers he brought, and never realized I was being scammed until my bank account was empty. Instead, I used the techniques you taught me. I documented his phone calls, researched his supposed organization, set up my own surveillance system. When he showed up at my door with fake Medicare forms designed to steal my personal information, I was ready for him. The police arrested him based on the evidence I'd gathered, and it turned out he was part of a group that had scammed dozens of seniors across the Southwest. Because of what you taught me, I wasn't just protecting myself. I was helping protect an entire community of vulnerable people. But the most important thing you taught me wasn't how to catch a scammer. You taught me that my experience, my intelligence, and my instincts are all still sharp at 68. You reminded me that I've survived 7 decades of challenges, and I'm more than capable of handling whatever comes next. Thank you for showing me that being older doesn't mean being weaker. Sometimes it just means being wiser and more experienced, and much more dangerous to people who underestimate us." I read Dorothy's letter 3 times, then filed it with dozens of others like it, all from people who'd discovered that their age was not a vulnerability but a strength. That evening, I sat in Harold's chair with my tea and his photograph, thinking about the unexpected direction my life had taken. "You know, honey," I said to his smiling face, "you always said I was a born teacher, but I thought that part of my life was over when I retired. Turns out I was just getting ready for the most important students I'd ever have." The house was quiet around me, but it wasn't empty. It was full of purpose, full of plans for tomorrow's workshop, full of the satisfaction that comes from knowing your skills and experience are making a real difference in the world. Marcus had tried to kill me because he thought Harold's widow would be an easy target. Instead, he'd awakened a teacher who'd spent 40 years learning how to identify problems, develop solutions, and share knowledge with people who needed it most. At 61 years old, I wasn't winding down my career. I was just beginning the most important work of my life. And somewhere out there, in communities across the country, there were predators who specialized in targeting seniors who were about to get a very unpleasant surprise. They were about to discover that this generation of elderly Americans included a lot of people who had spent their careers solving problems, and retirement had just given us more time to perfect our methods. The hunter had become the hunted, and Betty White was leading a whole army of teachers, nurses, accountants, engineers, and other professionals who decided that being older meant being wiser, not weaker. Marcus had taught me that I was much more dangerous than I'd realized. Now I was teaching others the same lesson, one workshop at a time. And at 61 years old, I was just getting started on the most satisfying teaching career of my life. This story isn't just about one woman fighting back against one criminal. It's about what happens when people realize that experience is a weapon, that knowledge is power, and that age brings not weakness but wisdom. If you're someone who's ever been underestimated because of your age, remember this: you've survived decades of challenges, solved countless problems, and learned lessons that younger people can't imagine. Your experience isn't a limitation, it's an advantage. And if you're someone who sees elderly people as easy targets, consider this a warning. We're not as helpless as you think we are. We're not as isolated as you believe. And we're definitely not as forgiving as you hope we'll be. Because in this classroom, we remember that the best lessons are the ones that teach people why they should never underestimate their teacher. Thank you for listening to my story. This is Betty White, reminding you that it's never too late to learn something new, and the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone assumes is harmless. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because we're not done teaching lessons yet.